So much of what you're about to hear is rooted in documented evidence and the real figures who walked Whitby's narrow lanes. Some dramatic licence has been taken, as storytellers are prone to do. But I leave it to you, dear viewer, to decide what in these accounts is truth and what is merely one of Whitby's tales. I will tell you everything, the documented, the rumoured and the imagined, and you must decide what to believe. The following is an extract from the diary of Mr. Bram Stoker, Esquire, 27th of July, 1890, Whitby. I feel today like a sailor who has at last reached safe harbour after weathering a long and punishing storm. Yet even as I set my bags down at number 6 Royal Crescent, I cannot shake the curious sense that Whitby, for all its calm appearance, may prove far from safe. For weeks I've been travelling with Henry across Scotland, and though I count it an honour to accompany the greatest actor of our day, the journey has been nothing short of exhausting. Everyone wishes to meet Irving. Every society, every committee, every club, every admirer, and Henry, in his generosity, agrees to attend each function without first consulting me. Thus, my diary has become a catalogue of engagements, detours, and last-minute obligations, all of which must be fitted into a schedule already strained to breaking. I've pleaded with him to send word that he cannot attend, but he will not hear of it. What ought to have been a stately procession across Scotland has instead become a gruelling marathon, with constant doubling back, hurried departures and late night arrivals. I feel worn to the bone, and Henry, though indefatigable on the stage, seems oblivious to the toll such chaos takes upon those who must manage it. It was he, however, that urged me to come to Whitby. "Bram," he said, "you must have rest, real rest, and there is no place like Whitby for clearing the mind." I confess now I doubted him, but now, standing here upon the Crescent, I begin to understand his meaning. The sea air is bracing, the view magnificent, and the town possesses a curious old-world charm that stirs something within me. Mr. Vasey, my delightful housekeeper, Mrs. Vasey, greeted me with such warmth that I felt revived all at once. She has already taken charge of my comfort, and I find her attentions most welcome after the rigours of the road. Florence and little Noel will join me in a week's time, but until then I have the town to myself. I intend to explore it thoroughly, for I feel certain that Whitby may offer me something that I have long sought, a place where my imagination may settle and take root. For months I've been labouring upon my Gothic tale set in Styria, with the mysterious Count Wampire at its centre. Yet the sea below. I cannot but feel the Count will be very much at home in this place. There is a grandeur here, and a darkness too, a sense of old secrets lying just beneath the surface. I shall take a walk now down to the harbour. There is a bench overlooking the sea, where I might sit and gather my thoughts. I'll bring my notebook, for I intend to write to Henry and tell him of a notion that has occurred to me, a device for the opening of my story, drawn from the strange maritime events of the coast. Perhaps the sea itself will give me the inspiration that I seek. Letter written by Mr. Bram Stoker to Sir Henry Irving, postmarked 29th of July, 18... My dear Irving, Until yesterday, the weather in Whitby has been much like that which we were enjoying in London when we last spoke. The air has been temperate and the sea gentle, and the town possessed of that quiet summer industry which seems to lull even the most anxious mind. But shortly before midnight, the atmosphere grew so oppressively still that even the most ignorant town dweller must have realised that a storm was approaching. The silence was of a peculiar kind which seemed to foretell calamity. It was as if the very air were holding its breath. You'll recall that Whitby possesses a great flat reef, treacherous and broad, upon which many a vessel has met its end. To guard against such misfortune, the Coast Guard has installed a searchlight upon the east cliff, its beam intended to guide craft through a narrow alley that is the only safe passage from the open sea into the dock. At midnight, the storm struck. The wind lashed the cliff with such violence that the lighthouse workers could scarcely keep their footing. Rain fell in dense sheets, and the town below seemed swallowed by darkness. The men had all they could do to swing the searchlight into position, but at last its beam shone out into the darkness. What it revealed caused their blood to run cold. In a circle of light, a foreign schooner, with all its sails set, was racing headlong towards the reef. No vessel under God's heaven should be able to maintain such speed in such weather, nor approach the harbour with canvas unfurled. The lighthousemen braced themselves for the crash which they believed inevitable. And then a curious thing happened. Just when all seemed lost, the wind, which had been raging in an easterly direction, suddenly shifted to the northeast. It was abrupt, unnatural, and so unheard of that the men cried out in astonishment. The schooner, instead of striking the reef, glided smoothly and easily between the piers and came to rest within the harbour as gently as though guided by an unseen pilot. The hastily assembled rescue party, expecting the worst, were hugely relieved and waded out to greet their seafaring colleagues from distant shores. But what they encountered was far worse than any shipwreck. I attended the inquest this morning, for the incident had stirred the whole town. We heard that as the rescue party approached the schooner, some reported seeing a huge black dog leaping from the vessel and hurtling up the cliff face. The schooner's crew were nowhere to be found. Only the captain remained, discovered lashed to the wheel, his duty fulfilled unto death. Upon the table lay a bottle containing the final entries, written in a trembling hand. I copied several passages, for they possessed a dreadful simplicity that no invention could surpass. Extracts from the captain's log of the Demeter. 24th of July. There seems some doom over this ship. Men are all in panic of fear. 2nd of August, midnight. Woke up hearing a cry, one more God, Lord help us. 4th of August. Still fog, which the sunrise cannot pierce. I saw it, him. God forgive me. I shall tie my hands to the wheel, and that which he, it, dare not touch. The magistrate declared the matter closed, but I confess I cannot rid myself of the impression that something more than mere chance was at work. When the newspapermen pressed the coroner to say whether the captain's log offered an explanation as to why something so worthless a cargo had been carried across the North Sea, the coroner replied that the log was silent on the matter, leaving those 50 crates of earth as the most perplexing detail of all. And now, my dear Irving, I must confess to you that I do not write to you as a witness to a strange maritime occurrence, but as a fellow craftsman. You know that before coming north, I've been labouring upon a Gothic tale set in Styria, with a central figure whom I'd named Count Vampire. I believe the Austrian setting would lend the story the requisite foreignness and gloom. I found myself witness to townsfolk speaking of wrecks on this coast, including the Russian schooner Dmitri of Narva blown helplessly into this harbour in '68, carrying mysteriously a cargo only of sea sand. There is something in Whitby, Henry, something in these storms, its cliffs, its graveyard perched above the sea, its ancient superstitions and its strange tales. I begin to think that my Count may find his true home not in the mountains of Styria, but here on this wild Yorkshire coast. The incident of the schooner, the dead captain, the vanished crew, and the great black dog leaping from the deck, these things, however fanciful they may sound, are rooted in truth here. And truth, as you've often reminded me, is the strongest foundation for terror. I find myself discovering very strange tales indeed about Whitby, and I feel with a kind of shiver that I am standing at the threshold of a story that I have been seeking. Your affectionate friend, Bram. Diary of Mr. Abraham Stoker, 30th of July, 1890, Whitby. Mrs. Vasey's has already established a morning routine for me, and I find myself submitting to it with surprisingly good humour. Each day, shortly after breakfast, she shoos me from my room with a firmness that brooks no argument, insisting that she cannot keep a proper house unless I leave her to her work. Thus I am turned out into the sunshine like a schoolboy, and have begun to take a gentle stroll down Cliff Street while she sets the place to rights. It is a pleasant descent, lined with modest houses, whose narrow gaps and crooked alleys offer sudden, striking glimpses of the East Cliff. Through these slivers of space, I catch sight of St. Mary's, perched high above the town, and beyond it, the gaunt ruins of the Abbey, rising stark and solemn against the sky. There is something almost theatrical in the way these great shapes reveal themselves. A fragment of wall here, a broken arch there, as though the very landscape were offering me hints of some ancient drama played out long before my arrival. I find these small discoveries strangely invigorating, and they lend my morning walks a quiet charm that I had not expected. Let's get a drink. Hope you're enjoying the stories so far, and the view and the weather. Stay out the way of the car. Okay, so we're heading down Cliff Street now. So here we go. Diary of Mr. Abraham Stoker, 1st of August, 1890, Whitby. I spent 2 full days exploring Whitby, and already the town has begun to disclose its gentler secrets. Yesterday, I discovered a library, a modest, peaceful place tucked behind the churchyard, where the windows look out over the harbour and the sound of the tide seems to steady one's thoughts. I've taken a small desk near the window and find it an ideal spot to work. The light falls kindly upon the page, and the quiet industry of place encourages one to think with purpose. I've even made a new acquaintance, Mr. Ray, a fellow researcher whose interests lie in the old tales and ghostly histories of the coast. He possesses a curious mixture of scholarship and superstition, and speaks with such relish of local legends that I cannot help but be drawn in. He promised to show me certain places and tell me stories, which he assures me may prove useful to a writer of the Gothic persuasion. I find his company most stimulating, and begin to suspect that Whitby may offer me not only rest, but the very inspiration that I've been seeking. There is something in the air here, a mingling of learning and old fear that quickens the imagination. For the first time in many months, I feel my thoughts are beginning to take shape. Letter written by Mr. Bram Stoker to St. Henry Irving, postmarked 9th of August, 1890, from Whitby. My dear Irving, I write to you from a small desk in Whitby Library, where I've spent the better part of the afternoon poring over a curious volume that has set my imagination alight. It is a history of Wallachia and Moldavia by one Wilkinson. A dry enough work at first glance, but containing certain passages of such strange and terrible interest that I find myself reading them twice over. In these pages, I encountered the name Dracula, which Wilkinson tells us is derived from Dracul, meaning the dragon or the devil, and belonging to a prince of the order of the dragon. The man himself, Vlad, son of Dracul, is prescribed as possessing an almost ferocity beyond belief. His punishments were monstrous, his cruelties unspeakable, and yet there is in the account a peculiar fascination, as though the author himself were half afraid to set down the truth, the dreadfulness of his deeds. There is something in its sound, a mingling of grandeur and dread, that seems to carry the very essence of the supernatural. I confess that as I read, the idea of Dracula began to take shape. The mind of a character drawn from such an image of being ancient cruelty, steeped in blood, superstition, whose shadow might fall across the centuries. It is too early to say where this thought may lead, but I feel the stirring of an old creative impulse, and Whitby, with its cliffs and storms and strange tales, seems to lend the notion a certain vitality. I shall continue my reading tomorrow, will write again if anything further suggests itself. For now, I remain your affectionate friend, Bram. Diary of Abraham Stoker, 10th of August, 1890, Whitby. My solitude has come to an end. Florence arrived yesterday with our little Noel in tow, both in excellent spirits after their long journey from London. I confess I was delighted to see them. A week alone had made me realise how much I missed the familiar rhythm of our life together. Yet it soon became clear that Florence has come for a holiday and expects us to spend our days as a family together. She did not travel all this way merely to sit idle while her husband buries himself in the library. She is, of course, quite right. I've been too much absorbed in my studies of late, and though the work has been invigorating, I cannot, in fairness, abandon her to her lodgings while I chase shadows and legends. This morning I told Mr. Ray that I must curtail my hours at the desk and asked him to let me know of any further discoveries which may be of interest. He agreed readily enough with a knowing smile, and I suspect that he understands the situation perfectly. For now I shall devote myself to the family, though I cannot deny that the thoughts stirred by Wilkinson's book continue to press upon my mind. Diary of Mr. Abraham Stoker, 12th of August, 1890. A note arrived for me this afternoon at Royal Crescent, written in Mr. Ray's neat, deliberate hand. It tells me that he's made several further discoveries in the old records and wishes to share them, believing they may be of particular interest to me. I confess the message stirred something in me, that same curious excitement I felt on reading Wilkinson's account. They had resolved to devote my days to Florence and Noel. Still, Mr. Ray's invitation is a kind one, and he proposed that we meet for a glass of something before dinner at Bagdale Hall this evening. Florence raised no objection, Indeed, she seemed amused of the idea of me being summoned by the local antiquarian. So I shall go, though with the understanding that my library hours must remain curtailed. Yet I cannot deny that I look forward to hearing what new tales or fragments he has unearthed. Whitby continues to weave its spell, even as I try to resist it. Diary, Mr. Bram Stoker, 13th of August, 1890, Whitby. Last night I found Mr. Ray waiting for me outside Bagdale Hall, standing beneath the great sycamore with his hat in his hand and an expression of quiet satisfaction on his face. Sitting here today on the beach in the sunshine watching Florence and Noel play, Whitby seems such a happy and carefree place. So different to the place Mr. Ray described to me that it beggars belief that this is the same town. But there is something in Ray's stories that leaves me in no doubt that when the sun goes down, Whitby is a very different place indeed. He greeted me warmly and said that though he'd invited me for a drink, the evening was far too fine to waste indoors. Besides, he added, what I have to show you is better illustrated in a walk. There was something in his manner, a mixture of scholarly excitement and peculiar Whitby superstition, that made me agree at once. Florence and Noel were content enough to dine without me, so I allowed myself to accompany him. Bagdale Hall, Mr. Ray began, was once the home of Brown Bushell, a man with tremendous zest for life and adventure, but not much by way of loyalty. When the English Civil War broke out, Bushell found himself an officer in Cromwell's army. He fought well enough under the parliamentarian banner. Within a year, he changed sides and took up arms for the king, commanding a ship in the Royal Navy. That might be the end of it, but Bushell was not a man to stay still. He stole the king's ship and sailed off to fight for the King of Spain before returning to England and astonishing once more to take arms for Parliament. He served as a model officer, but after the war, his past caught up with him. He was arrested, tried, and beheaded for treason. Almost immediately, the sightings began. His headless ghost was seen beside his grave, inside Bagdale Hall, and on a wooded path nearby, sometimes with his head tucked neatly under his arm, as though he were carrying a parcel home. But it's here is the curious part, Ray continued, lowering his voice as you ought. During the Napoleonic Wars, the sightings increased dramatically. At that time, seafaring men lived in constant fear of being press-ganged into the Navy. Yet even the press gangs would not take on ghosts. So the area said to be haunted by Brown Bushell became a safe refuge for mariners hiding from the gangs. A headless spectre was as good as a guard dog. As for recent reports, he added with a wry smile, I only found a handful. It seems after a lifetime of adventure, Brown Bushell has retired to his ancestral hall, amusing himself by terrifying the young serving maids. They say he appears headless before them, then flips their skirts above their heads. A mischievous fellow, even in death. I had barely taken the full measure of Mr. Ray's tale. The headless Bushell, the press gangs, the serving maid shrieking at Bagdale Hall, when he suddenly clapped his hands together and said, "Come." Without waiting for my reply, he strode off down the path, his coat flaring behind him like a sail catching the wind. I hurried to keep pace. There is another matter, he called back over his shoulder, something quite different, but no less curious. It lies only a short distance from here. His manner had changed, sharper now, more intent, and I sensed that whatever he meant to show me next was a story he'd been saving, one he relished in the telling. Ray slowed his pace as we approached the end of Baxter Gate, then pointed with his stick towards a handsome Georgian facade. Now then, he said, here's a curiosity. Looks fine enough at first glance, doesn't it? But look closely. It's only half a house. Window frames sliced clean in two. Bricked like a wound. And I can tell you exactly why. Just come round so you can see what he's talking about. Just got caught by traffic there. There you go. Windows spliced in two at the end of the building, right? He paused, clearly enjoying himself. In 1870, the resident here was Dr. Ripley, shy fellow, retiring, very much a man of science. He would not hear a word about ghosts, said they were nonsense, superstition, the product of weak minds. Unfortunately for him, his house contained one of the most visible phantoms Whitby has ever known. We walked a little further, and Ray continued lowering his voice as though sharing a confidence. Every evening, and I mean every evening, the ghost appeared at the upper window facing Brunswick Street, leaned right out, grimacing at passers-by. I remember the crowds gathering. My own father took me once, though he regretted it afterwards. People would stand in the street waiting for that infernal face to show itself. And when it did, it would pull those dreadful expressions, then vanish in an instant, leaving half the town staring up at an empty window. He chuckled softly. Poor Dr. Ripley was a terrible fix. He didn't want the nightly disturbance, but he absolutely refused to acknowledge the ghost. Couldn't call a priest, couldn't call an exorcist. To do so would be to admit the thing existed. So he came up with a solution that Whitby folks will talk about. Ray tapped the brick wall up at the end with the empty stick. He had half the house where the ghost lived demolished. Gone. Removed. Evicted by hammer and chisel. I remember the day they started. Half the town turned out to watch. Whitby said it was the only time a spectre had ever been driven out by a builder. He stepped back, letting me take in the strange half house. So there you have it, he said, a testimony in bricks and mortar to the existence of spectres, and a reminder that even the most rational man may find himself living with something that he cannot explain. He let the silence settle for a moment and added, but the reason only carries you so far in Whitby. Beneath all good sense and hard work, there are those that believe, and here Ray lowered his voice as though the very streets might be listening, that the coastal parts of North Yorkshire are haunted by a creature the old folk call the Yorkshire Barghest, a great black hound, 6 or 9 feet at the shoulder, with coarse hair, red eyes, and a mouth that foams like sea spume in a gale. They say that if you hear its howl, someone in your family is marked for death. He walked a few paces, tapping his stick against the cobbles. Now, Whitby has been a smuggler's town for centuries. Customs men were posted in busy ports like this to collect the crown's dues. So smugglers needed ways to slip past them. Tunnels were dug, whole networks of them running from the shoreline up to the town. There is talk of a beginning of a pub here on Old Baxtergate called the Old Smuggler, dating back to the early 15th century. A convenience place to store contraband if you knew the right door. Ray gave a dry chuckle. Smugglers hid their goods wherever they could. One of the most reliable places was a freshly dug grave. But to keep honest folk away from the churchyard at night, they encouraged tales of the Barghest. Nothing keeps a curious neighbour indoors like the thought of a demon hound prowling amongst the tombstones. He paused at the corner where the harbour first comes into view. Legend says the Barghest could be seen down by the boats in stormy weather, pacing back and forth before the harbour mouth. Fishermen took it as a warning. If they put out to sea, they would not return. And if a fisherman's wife heard the Barghest howl while her husband was away, she would know without a word being spoken that the sea had claimed him. Ray paused where the street opened out into the harbour, the masts rising like black strokes against the evening sky. "Well, Mr. Stoker," he said, settling his hat, "that is as much as I can give you tonight. Whitby has more stories than any man can carry, but she gives them out sparingly." He tapped his stick once more on the cobbles. I caught him just as he turned to go. "Before you leave," I said, unable to hide my frustration, "tell me one more story." Ray gave a sympathetic shake of his head. "No time, Mr. Stoker, truly. My business takes me inland for several days." He hesitated and added, "But if you're determined to know more, ask the locals about the Abbey bells, and they'll tell you what they dare." He tipped his hat with a faint, knowing smile, as though he understood exactly that he was leaving me to ponder, and then turned into the street, his footsteps fading into the hub of the harbour, the door he had just opened closing just as quickly behind him. Let's take a sip. Letter from Sir Henry Irving to Sir Henry Irving from Bram Stoker Esquire, postmarked 15th of August 1890, Whitby. My dear Irving, I take up my pen this evening to give you account of my progress here in Whitby, though it has taken a curious and somewhat vexing turn. Mr. Ray, who'd begun to unlock the town's hidden life with such generosity, informed me last night that his business would take him inland for several days. He left me only a hint that if I wish to know more, I should ask the harbour folk about the Abbey bells, and then vanished up the street before I could press him further. I confess, my dear Irving, that I felt a sharp stab of frustration. He had opened a door and closed it again before I could step through. Determined not to be thwarted, I went down to the harbour and approached an old fisherman perched on a coil of rope. His face was furrowed and knotted like the bark of an ancient tree, and he spoke of storms and voyages that belonged to another age. Thinking him a likely source, I asked what he knew of the Abbey bells. He fixed me with a sharp, dismissive look and told me that such tales were worn out and not worth troubling myself over, muttering that they were for trippers and day visitors, not for the likes of me. Before I could press him, he turned away, leaving me with nothing but the wind and the sense that Whitby's stories were guarded more fiercely than I had imagined. This morning, I returned with Florence and our young Noel, and it was remarkable to see how the harbour folk softened at the sight of the boy. Noel sat among them with bright curiosity, and in his presence they spoke more freely of storms, shipwrecks, and the strange lore that clings to this coast. At one point I whispered to him very quietly to ask about the Abbey bells, for I suspected they might answer the child where they would not answer me. He did so with perfect innocence, and the old fisherman who'd rebuffed me yesterday leaned at once, as though the telling were permissible only to a boy. He said that in the worst storms, when the sea rose black against these cliffs and the harbour lights were swallowed by rain, folk would hear the Abbey bells tolling, though no hand had touched them. The sound, he told Noel, was taken as a warning that a ship was fighting for its life beyond the mouth of our harbour. Others added the bells were heard on nights when no living soul was near the ruins, and they rang for the drowned, calling them home. Once the tale of the bells was told, the harbour folk warmed further, and other stories followed. One man spoke of mermaids and mermen, not the fanciful creatures of sailors' yarns, but the old Whitby belief that the sea keeps its own people. He told Noel of a merman said to have been caught in fishermen's nets in 1535 at a village just outside Whitby. The creature, unable to speak and eating only raw fish, lived among the villagers for several weeks, treated with kindness and watched with wonder. He was said to have had an eye for the ladies, though no one could describe him clearly. At last, he made his way to Whitby Harbour, where he slipped back into the water and frolicked before the gathered crowd, and then vanished beneath the waves, never to be seen again. Another man, older still, spoke of the penny hedge, a legend far older than any living memory. He told Noel how, in 1159, 3 hunters pursued a wild boar into the chapel of a hermit who refused them entry, and how they beat the poor man so savagely that he could not recover. The hermit forgave them with his dying breaths, but the abbot of Whitby decreed that their descendants must perform penance each Ascension Eve. To weave a hedge of hazel stakes on the east side of the harbour, cut with a knife costing 1 penny, strong enough to withstand the rising tide. The man added, with a solemn nod, that the hazel was chosen for its ancient power against witches and black magic, and that the hermit who had lived in a hazel grove wished to protect the town, even in his death. The hedge, he said, is still planted each year. Noel listened wide-eyed, Florence with a kind of solemn wonder, and I with a growing conviction that Whitby is a place where the natural and the supernatural sit side by side as comfortably as neighbours at a hearth. I began to feel, my dear Irving, that part of my novel must be set here, and that I should bring my characters to this very harbour to meet these very people. So do not be surprised if the stories I write to you about the bells, the merman, the penny hedge, and the strange warnings carried on the wind find their way into the page of my book. Whitby has taken hold of my imagination, and I suspect it will not let go. Your affectionate servant, Stoker. I'm glad you're enjoying it, Linda. Thank you for that. Very nice, very kind. We'll just take a sip of water and we'll recommence. Diary of Bram Stoker, 16th of August 1890, Whitby, Friday morning. I rose early today with the intention of setting down the particulars of Whitby's aspect, for I shall need them when I return to London. The town has taken such a hold on my imagination that I feel compelled to make a faithful record of its features while they're still fresh before me. Standing by the harbour, I watched the tide running swiftly through the narrow channel, dividing the town as though it was 2 separate worlds joined only by the water. To the west, the retiled roofs huddled together in friendly disorder, their chimneys leaning at curious angles. And beyond them, the great sweep of the West Cliff rises, broad and confident, crowned by the crescent and the handsome lodging houses. Turning eastward, the scene grows more old, more solemn. The houses climb steeply up the gables, their gables jutting forward as they're peering down above the water. Above them stands the ruins of the abbey, stark against the sky, and beside it the churchyard with its ranks of weathered stones. The long stairway that leads up, worn by centuries of feet, zigzags its way to the summit like a ribbon laid upon the rock. Beyond the harbour, the sea mouth opens, the waves breaking against the two piers with steady rhythmic force. Looking south across the valley, the river winds inland beneath a great viaduct, whose tall arches stride across the landscape with a kind of iron certainty. It is a modern structure, almost startling in its scale, and it seems to make the valley appear longer and more distant than it truly is. From here, it stands a reminder that Whitby, for all its ancient character, is not untouched by the age of engineering. It is a view of contrasts, the domestic and the wild, the ancient and the modern, the safe harbour and the open sea. I must remember it well, for I think it will serve me in the pages of my book. Letter from Mr. Ray to Mr. Bram Stoker, postmarked 15th of August 1890, Darlington, delivered to Smith Stoker's lodgings on the morning of the 16th of August 1890. My dear Mr. Stoker, I must beg your indulgence, for business has detained me longer than expected, and I fear I shall not return to Whitby as soon as I'd hoped. You showed such interest in the stories of this place that I feel it's only right to set down a few particulars for you, lest my absence deprive you some of the more curious features of the town. I am sure by now you'll be familiar with Church Street, leading as it does to the Abbey steps. But I've taken the liberty to include in these pages some stories about buildings you'll encounter as you stroll along it. In gathering these notes for you, I came upon a printed source of some antiquity which sets forth in plain and rather chilling terms the reputation Whitby has long possessed. It records apparitions both before and after death are of course not infrequent in Whitby. Many a valuable house stood untenanted for years on suspicion of it being haunted. The last residents having experienced considerable alarm and anxiety, the bedclothes torn off, the china broke, the furniture demolished. Strange traditions exist of certain yards, lanes and alleys, of some terrible homicide there committed, of departed spirits, of which they have walked for several nights successively, deprived of their rest, desirous of being addressed by someone, but none daring. I took this from the Whitby Repository of 1828. Such accounts may strike you as exaggerated, yet they accord closely with the reputation many of our older houses still bear. More than one building on Church Street has long been whispered about in this manner. It is a history marked by disturbances of the very sort the repository describes. The first of these is the White Horse and Griffin, Whitby's most famous inn. Built in 1691 as a coaching house on the Whitby York mail run, it has welcomed many distinguished guests, Dickens, Tennyson, Carroll among them. And its oyster strewn yard is said to have inspired Lewis Carroll's Walrus and the Carpenter. Yet, for all its fashionable history, the place has darker corners. At the courtyard, the old mailroom, a bleak chamber with iron gates, where prisoners once waited for trial, transportation, or the gallows at York. The inn is reputed to be haunted by three spirits. The first is Sarah, a serving maid whose clumsiness proved her undoing. She tripped at the entrance and fell straight through the beer hatch onto the cellar, breaking her neck. Some whisper she'd been with child by the landlord's son, and a careless fellow may have pushed her to avoid responsibility. Whether accident or malice, Sarah is said to linger in the cellar still, and those who venture down sometimes feel a pair of hands give their shoulders a playful squeeze. The second ghost is an old sea captain with a curious fascination for keys. Guests on the top floor often find themselves locked out of their rooms, their keys vanished without trace. The staff will tell you that the captain's mischief is as regular as the tide, and that he has been stealing keys for longer than anyone can remember. The final spirit, and the one most often spoken of, is Mrs. Bowler, a formidable landlady of the late 19th century. She was known to take an instant liking or disliking to a person upon first sight, and once her judgment was made, nothing could alter it. One icy morning, she slipped on the steps at the side of the building, struck her head, and died. Her ghost is rarely seen, but her presence is felt. Those who visit the inn for the first time say they feel immediately either welcome or unwelcome, with nothing in between, as though Mrs. Bowler herself was still delivering a stern verdict upon their character. If you have the opportunity, I'd encourage you to step inside and see whether she favours you or not. If you did have a mind to visit a hostelry, you would do well to avoid the Black Horse, for it has long been known to attract the worst types in the town. In former days, it was the haunt of smugglers, of brawlers, ne'er-do-wells, and though the present landlord keeps respecting of house, the place has never quite shaken off its reputation. One fellow in particular, now long dead, was said to haunt the marketplace opposite, and his story is still told by the older folk. William Pickering was a notorious rogue and a habitual patron of the Black Horse. One winter's morning in 1710, he was drinking there at an hour where decent men were barely out of bed. A puppeteer newly arrived from London and well regarded in his profession came in to take shelter from the bitter cold. He was in Whitby to perform that evening and had been about his town putting up the billboards. Pickering, already inebriated, took it upon himself to mock the man, calling in a coarse way, "That's the way to do it," in imitation of Mr. Punch. He repeated the phrase again and again until the puppeteer, who saw himself as an artiste and not merely an entertainer, grew furious and left the Black Horse cursing Pickering with the venom of a man whose dignity had been trampled. Come the evening, Pickering was drunk, but out of money. He had a mind to see the puppet show, and being unwilling to pay, he chose to sneak in. He slipped through the side door and forced himself into the front row between two young women, where he sat grinning at the puppeteer with the same coarse cry, "That's the way to do it." The puppeteer, already incensed by this morning's insult, did his best to ignore him and continue the performance. Matters came to a head when two of the puppets embraced in a loving clinch, at which Pickering belched loudly and triumphantly. And that was the final straw. The puppeteer drew a dagger he had concealed in his cloak, and he lunged at Pickering with murderous intent. Pickering, though drunk, was not so far gone that he failed to react. He threw up his arm to shield himself. The puppeteer caught off balance, saw his blade deflected, and driven inside into the chest of a young woman seated beside Pickering. She died where she fell. The puppeteer fled into the night, but remorse overtook him, and he surrendered himself to the constable the following morning. He was taken to York, tried for murder, and hanged. His body was returned to Whitby and hung in a gibbet on Church Street for many years, a grim warning to all those who passed. It was said that denying a Christian burial unleashed a spirit upon the town, a man dressed in black, carrying a bloody weapon, running frantically through the marketplace as though still seeking a place to hide. Some claim to have seen him darting between the shadows opposite the Black Horse, and the older folk will tell you that his presence lingers whenever the wind comes down the valley with a certain sharpness. I trust that these notes will be of use to you, and that Whitby continues to yield its secrets in my absence. Yours sincerely, Michael Ray. Diary of Bram Stoker, 17th of August, 1890, Whitby, Saturday before sunrise. I cannot sleep. My mind is alive with the stories Ray has set down for me, And though the harbour lies still beneath my window, I feel as though something in this town is awake and moving. Last night I dreamt or drifted into a waking trance that I found myself on the lower portion of the 199 steps. Climbing slowly, the lamps extinguished, the sky drained of colour. The houses of Church Street lay below me in darkness, their gables leaning inward as though to listen. As I paused to catch my breath, I heard horses in the distance, a sharp neighing, a clatter of hooves upon stone. And at once Ray's tale of the Barger's coach rose in my mind, the spectral carriage that appears at the death of a sailor, hurtling down from the graveyard to carry his body to the bottom of the sea. In my dream, I saw it clearly, the black coach at the summit above me, its horses stamping and tossing their heads, the driver without a shadow or a face. Then came the crashing noise, the wheels striking each step in a terrible rhythm as the coach plunged downwards, gathering speed, the sound echoing through the narrow stair like thunder on a cavern. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, as the great vehicle hurtled past. So close, I felt the wind of its passage upon my cheek. Sparks flew from the hooves. The horses screamed. The coach roared downwards until, with a violent jolt, it slewed sideways and came to a halt upon the bend where the steps turned towards Church Street. The horses steamed in the cold air, their breath rising like smoke. Slowly, with dreadful ceremony, the door of the coach swung open. Inside was no corpse, no sailor, no driver, but a figure seated in the gloom, tall and pale, its eyes dark hollows that seemed to draw the strength from my limbs. It beckoned to me with a single languid motion, as though inviting me to step inside and surrender myself. The air around it pulsed with strange warmth, and I felt a hunger in its presence, not for flesh, but for vitality, for youth, for the spark of life itself. It was neither woman nor man, but something older, something that's fed for centuries upon the living. And I knew with dreadful certainty that Whitby was not merely a town, but a threshold, a place where the light of day falters, where ancient spirits walk with quiet, patient appetite. I cannot sleep. The vision of the coach still clings to me, and though I felt myself drawn towards the open door, some last reserve of strength rose within me. With all the energy I could muster, I cried out, "No!" The word torn from my throat like a man struggling against the tide. The figure within the coach turned its face towards me. Its face was, and I felt a gaze pass through my flesh and bone down to the very roots of my being. It shook its head slowly, almost sorrowfully, as though disappointed in my refusal. Then the door slammed shut with a force that echoed along the steps. The horses reared, their hoofs striking sparks from the stone. In an instant, the coach wheeled about and plunged downward towards the harbour, hurtling into the black water with a crash that seemed to shake the very air. I stood trembling, exhausted, yet even as the coach vanished beneath the waves, I felt another force at work, something drawing me upwards, pulling me up towards the churchyard. My limbs felt heavy, yet compelled as though invisible hands urged me on. I continued to ascend, each step steeper than the last, the night pressing close around me. Halfway up, I saw a movement above, 3 figures labouring under a terrible burden. As I drew nearer, I saw they were gravediggers, their faces pale and strained, manhandling 3 coffins up the steps with brutal effort. The coffin thudded against the stone, the sound dull and final, and the men did not look at me as they passed. They moved with grim purpose, as though obeying some command that could not be refused. I felt the pull grow stronger, still drawing me towards the summit, towards the churchyard, towards whatever presence awaited me there. I woke, or thought that I woke, with my heart pounding, yet the sense of that unforeseen force has not left me. I climbed on, compelled by an unseen force, the gravediggers labouring ahead of me with their grim burdens. As I grew nearer, the moon broke through the clouds and cast a pale light upon the coffins. The first of them was small, heartbreakingly small, no longer than the length of a child. The sight struck me with a pang of sorrow so sharp it seemed to pierce my chest. As a father, I know only too well, the terrible grief that must now be overwhelming some poor family, and I felt a wave of compassion rise within me, mingled with dread. The gravediggers heaved the little coffin upwards, its brass plaque catching the moonlight. I stepped closer, compelled by some dreadful curiosity, and read the inscription: Master Noel Stoker. My breath failed. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. I staggered, reaching out for the stone wall to steady myself. My hand only found air. The second coffin cluttered against the steps. Its plaque gleamed, Mrs. Florence Stoker. The third followed, larger, heavier, and upon it I saw my own name, Mr. Abraham Stoker, engraved with cold precision. The grave diggers did not look at me, did not speak, but continued their ascent with mechanical purpose, as though fulfilling a duty laid upon them by some ancient command. I tried to cry out and deny the truth of what I saw, but no sound left my throat. The coffins rose step by step, each impacting echo like a tolling bell. The gravediggers passed me without a glance, bearing their dreadful burdens towards the summit, and I felt myself drawn after them, as though every step seemed to drain my strength. The night pressed close, thick as smoke, and the sea below churned with a strange, unnatural restlessness. Whew, that's off the faint-hearted. As I reached the crest of the steps, I saw the first signs of a storm. A strange, hollow, booming drifted over the sea, faint yet unmistakable, as though some vast creature stirred beneath the waves. Then, without warning, the tempest broke. The calm water convulsed, rising in furious mountains that smashed upon Tate Hill sands, hurling themselves against the piers. I could just make out the white-crested waves sweeping over the lighthouse lanterns, drowning them in spume. The wind roared so violently that even up here I had to brace myself against the stones, the gusts threatening to tear me from my feet. Sea fog rolled inland in ghostly sheets, brushing my face with a coldness that felt like the touch of drowned men. Lightning rippled open the sky, revealing for an instant the wild chaos below. Fishing boats running madly for shelter, seabirds tossed like scraps of paper, and the new searchlight on the cliff sweeping its beam across the boiling dark. In one of those flashes, I saw a schooner far out to sea, all sails set, driving straight towards the harbour, that every instinct told me it could never reach it with the wind now backing east. Fog swallowed her again, leaving only the roar of the storm. Then the wind shifted to the northeast, tearing the mist aside, and I saw her clearly. It came slowly, as though pushed by an unseen hand, its sails torn, its rigging hanging like cobwebs. The vessel moved without sound, save for the faint creak of timber strained beyond endurance. I knew at once, though I'd never seen it before, the Demeter, the doomed ship from Varna, the vessel whose captain wrote of sleepless nights, of a presence aboard that drained the life from his men one by one. In my dream, the ship glided towards the harbour mouth, its prow cutting the black water with terrible purpose. A single figure stood on the deck, tall, motionless watching. The shore with intensity that seemed to pierce the night itself. The wind howled around him, yet his cloak did not stir. I felt the same force that had drawn me up the steps, now pulling me towards the cliff's edge, urging me to witness what was to come. It looked for all the world that Demeter would strike the harbour wall with a shuddering crash, but instead it smoothly glided onto the sands below me. The figure upon the deck did not move. The ship settled. For a moment all was still. Then the dog sprang from the deck, sprang up the cliffs as if it were a mere molehill, and raced past me as I stood in the graveyard, disappearing into the gloom. Diary of Mr. Bram Stoker, 18th of August, 1890. I woke this morning with a clarity I cannot account for. The terror of the night, the storm, the coffins, the strange schooner, all seemed softened as though viewed through a veil. My limbs felt light, my mind untroubled, and for a moment I wondered if the whole vision had been a fevered invention of an overtired imagination. The harbour lay quiet beneath my window, the gulls wheeling lazily above the rooftops. The sunlight upon the abbey made the stones appear almost golden. I felt to my surprise refreshed, invigorated even, as though some weight had been lifted from me in the hours of darkness. Yet beneath that brightness there lingers a faint unease, a sense that something has passed through Whitby in the night, and that the town, though unchanged, is somehow altered. Upon my breakfast tray lay a small folded note, the paper creased and smudged as though it had been written in haste. It was from Mr. Ray. He has returned to Whitby and writes that he'd be delighted to accompany me on a walk among the gravestones of St. Mary's, where he's promised to show me certain curiosities of local lore. He speaks of ancient customs, of old beliefs still whispered among the fishermen, and of inscriptions upon the stones that may interest a man who delights in character and history. The tone is cheerful, almost eager, and the invitation feels like a welcome return to the daylight world after the phantoms of the night. I find myself strangely drawn to accept. Perhaps a walk among the graves will steady my thoughts, and perhaps in the company of a learned man of the shadows, my dreams will lose their hold. Mr. Ray led me to an old Norman doorway on the south side of the church. Its arch worn smooth by centuries of wind and salt. This, he said, resting his hand upon the stone, is where the gravediggers of Whitby once gathered on St. Mark's Eve. I felt a faint chill, though the sun was warm upon the cliff. He told me that on the 24th of April, just before midnight, the men would assemble here in silence, waiting for the hour to strike. At the first toll of midnight, a procession of figures would appear upon the church path, pale, fleeting shapes that passed into the porch and vanished. These were not the ghosts of the long dead, Ray said, but those who would meet their death in the year ahead. The gravediggers counted them carefully, for the number foretold how many burials they would undertake, and thus how much money they might earn in the coming months. A grim sort of bookkeeping, Ray remarked, but practical men must make their reckonings where they can. I looked at the doorway, imagining the silent watchers, the midnight procession, the knowledge of death carried into the year like a ledger already written. Ray paused beneath a row of weathered old stones and looked out towards the sea. It's a curious thing, he said, that for a community of seafaring folk, there are so few sailors buried here. I raised an eyebrow, and he continued. The reason is simple, though grim. In 1820, the Scarborough Evening News reported that out of every 16 sailors alive in the Whitby district, 11 would either be maimed or meet their deaths in accidents at sea. Most funerals among the fishing families were conducted without a body, without a grave, without any earthly remains to commit to the soil. The sea keeps its own. He gestured towards the cliff edge, where the wind tugged at his coat. On the rare occasion that a sailor was buried at St. Mary's, When a body was recovered or washed ashore, the old folks said a spectral carriage would appear near the abbey. The bogus carriage, it was called, a harbinger, a warning, a sign that the sea had given up one of its dead. At this I felt a tightening in my chest. The memory of my dream, the black coach, the horses, the terrible descent rose unbidden. I know that story, I said more sharp than I intended. I do not wish to hear it again. Ray looked at me with mild surprise, but said nothing. I turned away from him and wandered amongst the graves, letting my fingers trace the worn inscriptions. The names seemed to call me. Rawlinson, Swales, Paxton, Sager. Each one a life lived upon this cliff, each one a story waiting to be told. I found myself reading them aloud, tasting the syllables, noting them down in my little book. There is something compelling in these stones, something that speaks of character, of history, of the quiet dignity of the dead. I felt, as I wrote these names, they may yet find their way in some future tale. Ray beckoned me towards a solitary stone near the cliff edge. Its surface once smoothed by centuries of salt wind. Upon it, a faint but still discernible, was the old emblem of a skull and crossbones. There is a tale about this one, he said, lowering his voice as though the dead might overhear. Some say a pirate of Whitby lies here, a black-hearted fellow who plagued the South Seas with his raids. He traced the carving with his fingertip. In one such raid, he forced a captain and his wife to walk the plank, but before he sent them to their death, he made the poor woman remove her fine silk shawl, intending it as a gift for his own wife. Ray shook his head. Years passed before the pirate returned to Whitby. When at last he did, he presented the shawl to his wife, who was so delighted she resolved to wear it only a Sunday best. He paused, letting the wind fill the silence. On the next Sunday, she dressed herself in the shawl and went to admire her reflection in the mirror. But instead of her own face, she saw staring back at her the captain's wife, her features rotted and swollen from years beneath the sea. The sight drove the pirate's wife into hysterics, and she spent the rest of her days in a local asylum. Ray straightened up, satisfied with the telling. I felt a shiver pass through me, though the sun was bright upon the stones. There is something unsettling about these old tales, a sense that the sea keeps its own justice, and the dead are never entirely silent. Ray led me towards the ruins of the abbey with a spring in his step, his voice rising with enthusiasm as he spoke of kings and synods and the long history of the place. The sunlight fell warmly upon its broken arches, and the sea glittered below us like hammered silver. You cannot understand Whitby, he said, without understanding Hilda. He spoke her with genuine affection, the wise abbess who brought peace to warring kings, who taught the rough folk of the coast to read, who shaped the very character of the town. One of the most fascinating marks she left, Ray continued, is the legend of the snakes that she turned into stone. He stooped to pick up an ammonite from its path, its spiral ridges catching the light. I can find no source for how far back it goes, but it was certainly known to the pilgrims of the Middle Ages who came to the Benedictine monastery that stood here after Hilda's time. They believed these fossils were serpents who'd driven from the cliff and turned to stone with prayer. He placed the ammonite in my hand. Our age may call it a naive attempt to explain what could not be understood, but the story of a holy woman defeating a serpent, of light overcoming darkness, is one of the oldest tales that we possess. It speaks the hope that good may triumph, that evil may be subdued, that the world may yet be made safe. Ray's eyes shone with conviction. His voice was bright, almost triumphant. I looked down at the ammonite in my palm, its cold, coiled shape echoing the serpents of my dream. The ancient hunger that had beckoned me from the coach, the dark figure upon the Demeter's deck. The sunlight seemed thin here, fragile, as though the ruins held their own shadow. Ray saw in these stones the victory of light. I saw something older, something that had not been defeated, only delayed. As we stood among the broken arches of the Abbey, I found myself glancing towards the tower. I hope, I said quietly to Ray, that we do not hear the Abbey bells. He looked at me with surprise. On the contrary, I wish we could. People wanted the bells of St Hilda's Abbey were so sweet they could calm storms. Their sound was a blessing upon the town. His words puzzled me. But down in the harbour, I said, they speak of the bells as a warning, a sound that foretold a death. The sailors dreaded hearing them. Ray laughed softly, shaking his head. Ah, that is a harbour tale. But the Abbey bells were the finest in the kingdom. When King Henry VIII ordered the dissolution of Whitby Abbey, he coveted those bells for himself. They were reputed to drive away evil. He sent a ship, secretly, to fetch them. He walked towards the cliff edge, his voice raising with animation. No one in Whitby knew of Henry's plan, so when the ship arrived to take the bells, the townspeople were furious, and the strangest thing happened. The children, every one of them, fell into a kind of trance. Down at the docks, they began to sing and dance, crying out that the Abbey bells were drowning. I felt a chill, though the sun was bright. The ship loaded the bells and set sail, Ray continued. It was a calm day, not a breath of wind to trouble the water. Yet as soon as the ship passed from the harbour mouth, it sank like a stone, crew and bells together, straight to the bottom of the sea, where they remain to this day. He paused, letting the wind fill the silence. And just as the ship began to sink, the townspeople swore they saw a great black dog appear on deck. It leaped to safety, landed on the beach, ran up the cliffs, and ever since folk have spoken of the hound of hell that roams the town. Ray smiled, pleased with his tale, seeing only the wonder and the folklore. I stood very still. The ammonite lay cold in my palm. The ruins cast long shadows across the graves. The sea below churned with a restlessness that I recognised. The dog, the sinking ship, the bells that could drive away evil, the darkness that arrived in Whitby, not last night, but 4 centuries ago. Ray saw it in these stories as a triumph of saints, the sweetness of bells, the hope that light might overcome darkness. But I had seen the darkness walk, and in that moment, with the wind rising around the Abbey and the sea whispering below, I understood at last what the bells had meant. Not a warning of death, but the warning of an arrival. Evil had come to Whitby long before the Demeter, and now it had come again. It is time now for me to leave. It is time for me to write my book. There we go. I do hope you enjoyed that tale of Whitby and Dracula. What a lovely spot it is up here. Oh. Thank you all for being great company. I've kept a side eye on the chat, but I haven't kind of wanted to cut across the story to interrupt it. Can you hear the bells calling out for us? I'm glad you enjoyed it, Tish. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Nikki. I'd say sometimes I just like doing things differently. Thanks, Pat. You know, and with actually something so photogenic and with just so much richness of history and this kind of darkness just woven in, nobody challenges the idea that goodness and evil live side by side in Whitby. It's just, you know, it's just part of the fabric of the town. And so irresistible really to tell a story like that. So thank you for joining me, one and all. Thank you for your support. It is most appreciated. Brought back such memories. Oh, text you. Yeah, well, I mean, I may well do that again at some point. As I say, I did kind of Dick Turpin in that way, and I did Moulton to a degree in that way. It's just kind of experimental stuff really now. Kind of, you know, I think you can use. I think a virtual tour can be a jump-off point, if that kind of makes sense. As long as it's kind of visual and you're walking and you're talking, it doesn't have to be, and here's this and that's history, and here's that and here's that. You know, it can be more sort of continuous and more kind of evolved, as you might say. Obviously, a lot more work involved, and that's, you know, that's on me. I choose to do it, but more satisfying. I think really to actually have, you know, it's like putting an album out rather than a single, if that kind of makes sense. You know, it feels like there's a substantial piece of work there to look back on. So I mean, hopefully. You know, after I'm gone, people can tune in and go, oh, look at that. What a nice video from Whitby. You know, that's what hopefully building a kind of legacy of stuff really. Thank you, Leslie. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. So I enjoyed it too. But the light is coming down. I've got a long drive home, so I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to head back to the car and look forward to doing well. I don't know about Saturday yet. We might just go for an easy stroll because I haven't really got time now to do any more. Sort of tour development work before Saturday, so it might just be a walk and a chat or something on Saturday. I don't know. I'll let you know. We'll do something, but it's probably not going to be anything of the calibre of this one. Should we put it that way? So thank you everybody for joining me. From Whitby, I will say goodbye.